Christmas. For most, it's a time of warmth, family, and tradition. The smell of pine, the glow of lights strung across porches, the sound of laughter echoing through living rooms. It's the one time of year when even the coldest places feel a little warmer, when strangers smile at each other in grocery store aisles, when small towns come alive with the kind of community spirit that makes people believe, even for a moment, that the world is fundamentally good. But for some small towns across America, the holiday season became something else entirely. A hunting ground, a stage, a carefully calculated window of opportunity for people who understood that chaos provides cover, that distraction creates blind spots, that when everyone is looking at the lights, no one notices the shadow. 7 cases, 7 killers. Each one used the cover of Christmas, the noise, the travel, the influx of strangers, the preoccupation with shopping and celebration, to commit acts that still echo in the places they happened. These aren't stories about supernatural forces or urban legends. These are solved cases, real investigations, real evidence, real killers who walked among neighbors, co-workers, and friends, hiding behind the festive chaos while they planned their next move. What you're about to hear are the forensic details, the investigative breakthroughs, and the human behavior that led to resolution. The trace evidence that couldn't lie, the behavioral patterns that couldn't be hidden, the small inconsistencies that unraveled entire facades. But the question remains, what kind of person uses Christmas as camouflage for murder? This is Plain Sight Docs, and these are the Christmas killers who stalked small-town America. The first gift, the silent stalker of Eastlake's toy store. December 1989. Eastlake, Ohio. A small Midwestern town tucked along the cold edge of Lake Erie, just east of Cleveland. Population under 20,000. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors by name. Where the local toy store was a seasonal gathering point every December, buzzing with parents and children hunting for the perfect gift. Where Christmas was the busiest, loudest, most predictable time of year. That predictability made it the perfect cover. The town itself was unremarkable in the best way. Quiet streets lined with modest single-family homes, most built in the 1950s and 60s. A main drag with family-owned businesses that had been there for generations. Hardware stores, diners, a single-screen movie theater that showed second-run films. And at the center of it all, Henderson's Toy Emporium, a 2-story brick building with a hand-painted sign and a window display that changed every season. In December, it was the heart of Eastlake. Everyone shopped there. Everyone knew the staff. It was tradition. The store had been owned by the Henderson family since 1952. By 1989, it was being run by the founder's son, a man in his 60s named Paul Henderson, who still worked the floor during the holiday rush. The staff was a mix of long-time employees and seasonal hires, mostly local women who knew the inventory by heart and could recommend the perfect toy for any age group. It was the kind of place where customer service meant something, where people came back year after year not just for the products, but for the experience. On December 18th, 1989, a woman named Carol Jensen was found dead in her home. Carol was 32 years old, blonde hair, usually worn in a ponytail during her shifts. Quiet demeanor. She'd worked the register at Henderson's Toy Emporium for 4 years, mostly during the holiday season. She was reliable, punctual, pleasant with customers but not overly social with her coworkers. She lived alone in a small rental house on Maple Avenue, just 3 blocks from the store. It was a modest, single-story home with white siding and a small front porch. The kind of house you'd walk past without noticing. Her body was discovered by a neighbor, Helen Pritchard, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. Helen had noticed Carol's porch light still on well past noon. That wasn't like Carol. She was responsible. She always turned off the light in the morning before leaving for work. Helen walked over and knocked on the front door. No answer. She tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Helen called out Carol's name. Silence. She stepped inside. The living room was small and tidy. A couch, a coffee table, a small television on a stand. And Carol, lying on the couch, arms folded across her chest, legs straight, head resting on a pillow. Helen thought, for just a moment, that Carol might be asleep. But then she saw the ribbon, red satin ribbon, tied in a neat bow around Carol's wrists, and the marks on her neck. Deep, dark ligature marks that cut into the pale skin. Helen backed out of the house and called the police. Eastlake police arrived within minutes. It was a small department, fewer than 20 officers, and they rarely dealt with violent crime. Most of their work involved traffic stops, noise complaints, and the occasional domestic disturbance. This was different. Detective Raymond Kelso was the lead investigator. He was in his late 40s, a lifelong Eastlake resident who'd been with the department for over 20 years. He'd worked exactly 3 homicides in his entire career, all domestic related, all solved within days. This didn't feel like those cases. Inside Carol Jensen's home, the scene was disturbingly controlled. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no defensive wounds immediately visible on Carol's hands or arms. The house was neat, organized, almost untouched. Carol's body had been carefully arranged. Her arms were folded across her chest as if she were lying in state. Her legs were perfectly straight, ankles together. Her head was positioned on a decorative throw pillow from the couch, and around her wrists, tied with precision, was the red ribbon. Detective Kelso called the county medical examiner. The autopsy was performed the following day. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. The ligature marks on Carol's neck were deep, clean, and consistent with a thin, rigid material. Not rope, not a belt, not fabric. The medical examiner noted that the marks suggested a wire or cable, something that didn't stretch, something that cut into the tissue with very little give. The time of death was estimated at somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight on December 17th. There were no signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds. The toxicology report came back clean. Carol hadn't been drugged. She hadn't been drinking. She'd simply been strangled, quickly and efficiently, by someone who knew what they were doing. Detective Kelso began reconstructing Carol's final day. She'd worked the afternoon shift at Henderson's Toy Emporium on December 17th. From noon until 7 p.m., coworkers reported that she'd seemed normal. Tired, maybe. It was the height of the holiday rush, and the store had been packed all week, but otherwise fine. She'd clocked out at 7:03 p.m. She'd walked home, just 3 blocks. Neighbors reported seeing her arrive at her house around 7:20 p.m. The lights in her house had been on until around 10 p.m., then went dark. No one had heard anything unusual. No screams, no sounds of a struggle. The front door had been unlocked when Helen Pritchard found Carol's body, but there was no sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged locks. Whoever had entered the house had either been let inside or had access to a key. Detective Kelso canvassed the neighborhood. No one had seen anything suspicious. No unfamiliar cars. No strangers walking around. It was a quiet residential street. People kept to themselves. The initial assumption was robbery. The holidays brought desperation. People needed money for gifts, but nothing was missing from Carol's house. Her purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter, wallet inside. $40 in cash. Credit cards still there. Her small television was still in the living room. A jewelry box on her bedroom dresser. Costume jewelry. Nothing expensive, but still hadn't been touched. Everything of value remained exactly where it had been. So if it wasn't robbery, what was it? Detective Kelso started looking into Carol's personal life. She was single. No boyfriend, current or recent. No ex-husband. No romantic entanglements that anyone knew about. She was private. She didn't socialize much outside of work. She attended church occasionally. She had a few friends, mostly other women from the store, but none of them reported any concerns. Carol hadn't mentioned feeling threatened. She hadn't talked about anyone following her or making her uncomfortable. The investigation hit a wall. Then, 3 days later, on December 21st, another call came in. Linda Ferraro, 28 years old, Dark hair, shoulder length, outgoing personality. Worked the sales floor at Henderson's Toy Emporium, specializing in the doll section. She was good at her job, patient with children, knowledgeable about the products. She'd been with the store for 2 holiday seasons and had been asked to come back both years. Linda lived alone in a modest apartment complex on the east side of Eastlake, about a mile from Carol's house. The complex was called Lakeview Gardens, a somewhat optimistic name for a 2-story brick building with 12 units. Linda's apartment was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot. She'd been scheduled to work the morning shift on December 21st. When she didn't show up, her manager, a woman named Diane Mercer, tried calling. No answer. Diane figured maybe Linda was sick. Maybe she'd overslept. It happened. But when Linda didn't show up for her evening shift either, and still didn't answer her phone, Diane started to worry. She called Linda's emergency contact, her sister, Maria Ferraro, who lived about 20 minutes away in Willoughby. Maria drove to Linda's apartment. She had a spare key. She knocked first. No answer. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. The lights were off. Maria called out her sister's name. Silence. She walked down the short hallway to the bedroom. The door was open, and there, on the bed, was Linda. Maria's scream brought neighbors into the hallway. Detective Kelso arrived at Lakeview Gardens within 30 minutes of the 911 call. The moment he saw Linda Ferraro's body, he knew. Same method, same presentation. Strangled with what appeared to be a thin wire or cable. Arms folded across her chest. Red satin ribbon tied around her wrists in a perfect bow. The only difference was the setting. Linda's body had been arranged on her bed, the comforter pulled up to her waist, as if someone had carefully tucked her in for the last time. Her head rested on the pillow. Her eyes were closed. The medical examiner arrived and confirmed what Kelso already suspected. Ligature, strangulation. Same type of ligature marks. Same depth. Same clean, precise cuts into the tissue. The time of death was estimated at the previous night, December 20th, between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. This time, there were defensive wounds. Small cuts and bruising on Linda's hands and forearms. She'd tried to fight back, but it hadn't been enough. Again, nothing was missing. No forced entry. No signs of robbery. Linda's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her jewelry was untouched. The apartment was neat, organized. The only indication that anything violent had happened was in the bedroom. 2 women, both from the same toy store. Both killed in the same ritualistic manner. Both discovered just days before Christmas. Both strangled with the same type of wire. Both posed with red ribbon. This wasn't random. This was targeted, methodical, personal. Panic spread through Eastlake. The local newspaper, the Eastlake Gazette, ran front-page stories. Parents kept their children inside. Women who lived alone began staying with family or friends. The toy store saw a sharp drop in foot traffic. People were terrified, and they were asking the same questions. Who was doing this? Why these 2 women? Was anyone else in danger? The Eastlake Police Department, overwhelmed and under-resourced, requested assistance from the Lake County Sheriff's Office and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. A task force was assembled. Detectives set up a command center in the Eastlake Municipal Building. They began by looking for connections between Carol Jensen and Linda Ferraro beyond their employment at Henderson's Toy Emporium. Both were single. Both lived alone. Both were in their late 20s to early 30s. Both were considered friendly, but relatively private. Neither had a boyfriend or recent romantic relationship that raised red flags. Neither had reported feeling threatened or followed in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Neither had any known enemies. The task force's first major lead came from a tip called into the police hotline on December 22nd. A local man named Eugene Marshall had been seen around town in early December, asking for work near the shopping district. Marshall was a drifter, originally from Pennsylvania, with a history of petty theft and vagrancy. He'd been staying at a low-rent motel on the outskirts of Eastlake, the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask too many questions. He'd been doing odd jobs for cash, loading trucks, moving furniture, shoveling snow. Several people reported seeing Marshall near Henderson's Toy Emporium in the days before the first murder. He'd been hanging around the shopping area, asking store owners if they needed help. Some had given him work. Others had turned him away. Detectives brought Marshall in for questioning on December 23rd. He was 41 years old, thin, with a thick beard and a worn green jacket he seemed to wear everywhere. He was nervous, fidgety, clearly uncomfortable under interrogation. "Where were you on the nights of December 17th and December 20th? Marshall said he'd been drinking on the 17th, at a bar called The Lantern about 2 miles from Carol Jensen's house. He'd been there most of the evening. He couldn't remember exactly what time he'd left, but it was late. Maybe 11 p.m., maybe later. He'd walked back to the motel, alone. The bartender at The Lantern, a man named Gary Hobbs, remembered Marshall vaguely. Marshall's appearance was distinctive. The beard, the green jacket. Hobbs confirmed he'd been there on the 17th, but he couldn't pinpoint the exact time Marshall had left. It was a busy night. People came and went. On the night of December 20th, Marshall claimed he'd been at the motel watching television. The motel owner, a woman named Doris Fletcher, couldn't confirm it. She said she didn't keep track of her tenants' comings and goings. Marshall's room faced the parking lot. She hadn't seen him leave, but she also hadn't been watching. Detectives searched Marshall's motel room. They found nothing. No wire, no ribbon, no items belonging to either victim. No evidence linking him to the crime scenes. His clothing was dirty, worn, but there were no bloodstains, no fibers that matched anything from the victims' homes. They held him for 48 hours, then released him. There wasn't enough to charge him. The investigation stalled, and then the forensic reports came back, and everything changed. The wire used to strangle both victims wasn't standard hardware store material. It was high-tensile steel cable. The diameter was approximately 1.5 millimeters. The tensile strength was rated for industrial applications, rigging, mechanical repair, precision work, situations where failure wasn't an option. It wasn't the kind of wire you'd use to hang a picture frame or fix a fence. It was specialized, and it left a very specific type of mark. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Samuel Greenfield, compared the ligature marks on both victims under magnification. The width, depth, and pattern were identical. Same wire, same method, same killer. The angle of the mark suggested the killer had approached from behind in both cases, wrapping the wire around the victims' necks and pulling with significant force. But there was something else. Trace fiber analysis, conducted by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Forensic Lab, revealed tiny synthetic threads found on both victims' clothing, on Carol's sweater, on Linda's blouse. The fibers were consistent with polyester blend fabric, dyed a specific shade of dark blue. When analyzed under a microscope and compared against commercial textile databases, the fibers matched the material used in the uniforms worn by employees at Henderson's Toy Emporium. The store's uniforms were custom-made by a regional supplier based in Akron. Dark blue polo shirts with the store's logo, a teddy bear holding a toy train, embroidered on the chest. Employees wore them during shifts. The fibers found on both victims were consistent with those uniforms, suggesting recent, close physical contact with someone wearing one. This changed everything. Investigators refocused. They began looking inward, at the toy store itself. Henderson's Toy Emporium employed about 15 people during the peak holiday season, a mix of full-time staff and seasonal hires. Detectives re-interviewed all of them. Most were women. Most worked the day shifts. Most had solid alibis for both nights. Most had been cooperative from the beginning and had nothing suspicious in their backgrounds. But there was one person who kept appearing in the periphery of the investigation. Someone who worked at the store but wasn't on the main sales floor. Someone who knew Carol and Linda but wasn't part of their social circle. Someone who was there, always, but never quite visible. Richard Stone, night shift manager. Richard Stone was 37 years old. He'd worked at Henderson's Toy Emporium for 6 years. Single. No criminal record. No history of violence. No prior arrests. He was quiet. Kept to himself. Never caused trouble. Never raised his voice. Never participated in the staff holiday parties or the informal gatherings after closing. Most employees barely knew him. He came in after closing, usually around 9 p.m., and worked alone. His job was to handle inventory, restock shelves, organize the stock room, and lock up the store at the end of his shift, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. By the time the morning shift arrived, he was gone. His presence was marked only by the work he'd completed overnight, the shelves that had been restocked, the inventory logs that had been updated, the floors that had been swept. Richard Stone lived alone in a small apartment on the south side of Eastlake, about 15 minutes from the store. He drove an older model sedan, a beige Toyota Camry. He didn't socialize. He didn't drink. He didn't attend church. He didn't have hobbies that anyone knew about. He was, by all accounts, invisible, reliable, unremarkable. But he had access. He had access to the employee schedules, which were posted in the back office. He knew when people worked. He knew when they had days off. He knew their routines. And he had access to personnel files, which included emergency contact information, home addresses, phone numbers, next of kin. Richard Stone had worked the night shifts leading up to both murders. On December 17th, the night before Carol Jensen was killed, he'd closed the store. His shift had ended at 2:47 a.m., according to the time clock. On December 20th, the night Linda Ferraro was killed, he'd been scheduled to work but had called in sick at 8:30 p.m., about 30 minutes before his shift was supposed to start. That was unusual. Store manager Paul Henderson confirmed that it was the first sick day Richard Stone had taken in over a year. Stone was nothing if not reliable. Detectives brought Richard Stone in for questioning on December 27th. He agreed to come voluntarily. He seemed calm, cooperative, maybe a little confused about why they wanted to talk to him. The interview started simply. Detective Kelso and another investigator, Sergeant Laura Vance from the Lake County Sheriff's Office, sat across from Stone in a small interview room at the Eastlake Police Department. "Where were you on the nights of December 17th and December 20th? Stone answered without hesitation. On the 17th, he'd worked his regular shift at the toy store. He'd closed up around 2:45 a.m., driven home, and gone to bed. On the 20th, he'd been home all evening. He'd called in sick because he wasn't feeling well. A headache, some nausea. He'd stayed in, watched television, and went to bed early. Was there anyone who could verify that? No. He lived alone. He didn't have close friends. He didn't have family nearby. His parents had passed away years ago. He was an only child. Did he know Carol Jensen and Linda Ferraro? Yes, of course. They worked at the store. He saw them regularly. They were coworkers. Did he socialize with them? No. Not really. They worked different shifts. He was friendly with them, he said, but they weren't friends. He didn't really have friends at work. He preferred to keep to himself. Had he ever been to their homes? No. Why would he? Detectives asked if he'd consent to a search of his apartment. Stone hesitated, just for a moment. Then he agreed. He said he had nothing to hide. On December 28th, investigators executed a search warrant at Richard Stone's residence. The apartment was in a low-rise building on the south side of town, a 2-story structure with 8 units. Stone's apartment was on the first floor, in the back. It was a small, 1-bedroom unit. The interior was sparse. Minimal furniture. A couch, a coffee table, a small television on a stand, a dining table with 1 chair. No decorations. No photographs on the walls. No personal touches. Everything was clean, organized, almost sterile. In the kitchen, they found a utility drawer. Inside were basic tools: screwdrivers, pliers, a small hammer, a measuring tape, and coils of wire. High-tensile steel cable, 1.5 millimeters in diameter. several lengths of it neatly wound and stored in a plastic bag. The brand was identified as Redline Industrial, a supplier based in Cleveland that sold specialized rigging and mechanical supplies. Forensic technicians collected samples of the wire and sent them to the lab for comparison. In the bedroom closet, investigators found a cardboard box. Inside were spools of ribbon, red satin ribbon, the exact type used to bind the victim's wrists. The ribbon was from a craft store, a common brand, but the fact that Stone had multiple spools, far more than anyone would need for normal gift wrapping purposes, raised immediate suspicion. And then, in a drawer in the bedroom, underneath a stack of neatly folded clothing, they found a notebook. A plain, spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover. Inside were pages and pages of handwritten notes, dates, names, observations. The notebook detailed Richard Stone's thoughts about his coworkers, about the store, about the holiday season, about Carol Jensen and Linda Ferraro. The first entry referencing Carol was dated December 3rd, 1989. Carol corrected me in front of customers today. She said I'd miscounted a stack of board games in the stockroom. She said it in front of Mrs. Patterson and her daughter. Made me look incompetent. Made me look like I don't know how to do my job. She doesn't understand how hard I work. She doesn't see the hours I put in when no one else is there. She thinks she's better than me because she works the day shift, because customers see her, because she gets to smile and talk and be part of the holiday magic. But I'm the one who keeps everything running. I'm the one who makes sure the shelves are stocked. I'm the one who does the real work. The entry continued for several more lines, detailing his frustration and humiliation. Another entry, dated December 9th, referenced Linda Ferraro. Linda questioned my inventory counts today. She said several items in the doll section were missing from the stock logs. She asked if I'd made a mistake. The entries grew darker, more detailed, more obsessive. December 12th drove past Carol's house tonight. She lives alone. Lights off by 10 p.m. Quiet neighborhood, no one pays attention. December 15th, Linda leaves her living room, curtains open. I can see her television from the parking lot. She's careless. They're all careless. December 16th, I've decided. They need to understand. They need to know that I'm not invisible, that I have control, that I matter. The wire will be quick. The ribbon will be beautiful. There'll be gifts, final gifts, perfect and still. The final entry was dated December 19th. One more, then it's done. Then they'll all see. Richard Stone was arrested on December 29th, 1989. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the post-arrest interview, Stone initially denied everything. He said the notebook was fiction, that he sometimes wrote down thoughts as a way to cope with stress, that it didn't mean anything, that he would never hurt anyone. But when confronted with the physical evidence, the wire, the ribbon, the detailed observations in the notebook that matched the crime scenes, his composure began to crack. He sat in silence for several minutes. Then he started talking. He described the planning, the weeks he'd spent watching Carol and Linda, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities. He explained that the Christmas season had provided the perfect cover. Everyone was distracted. The streets were full of shoppers. The noise level was high. No one paid attention to a man in a coat walking through a residential neighborhood after dark. He'd entered Carol's house using a key he'd copied months earlier. She'd left her keys on the counter in the break room one day while she was on her shift. He'd taken them, driven to a hardware store, made a copy, and returned them within 20 minutes. She'd never noticed. He'd waited until she was home, until the lights went out. Then he'd let himself in. She'd woken up when she heard him in the living room. She'd started to scream. He'd moved quickly. The wire was in his hand. It was over in less than a minute. The ribbon, he explained, was symbolic. A gift. A final gesture. He wanted them to look peaceful, beautiful. He wanted them to be perfect. Linda had been different. She'd fought. She'd scratched him. She'd tried to run. But he was stronger. He'd caught her in the hallway. The wire had done its job. He arranged her on the bed. The ribbon. The positioning. The same ritual. Richard Stone was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in June 1990. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He's still incarcerated at the Mansfield Correctional Institution in Ohio. He's now in his 70s. He's never expressed remorse. In interviews conducted years later by criminal psychologists, he referred to the killings as necessary corrections. He said Carol and Linda had disrespected him, that they'd made him feel invisible, that the murders were his way of asserting control, of mattering. The people of Eastlake struggled to understand how someone so unremarkable, so invisible, had been capable of such calculated violence. But that was precisely the point. Richard Stone wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a drifter passing through. He was always there, in the background, watching, waiting, keeping track. Henderson's Toy Emporium closed permanently in 1991. Paul Henderson, the owner, said he couldn't continue operating after what had happened. The building still stands on Main Street, but it's been vacant for decades. The windows are boarded up. The hand-painted sign is faded and peeling. Locals avoid walking past it, not because they believe it's haunted, but because it reminds them of something they'd rather forget. Carol Jensen and Linda Ferraro were buried in Eastlake Cemetery, just a few miles from the toy store where they work. Their families still visit. Every December, red ribbons are tied to the trees near their graves, not as decoration, but as a reminder that Christmas isn't always safe, that small towns aren't always innocent, and that the people you see every day, the ones you barely notice, might be the most dangerous of all. The Christmas Eve break-in, the contradictory evidence in Elk River. Christmas Eve, 1997. Elk River, Maine. A remote fishing town clinging to the frozen edge of the North Atlantic. Population just over 3,000. The kind of place where the winter is long. The isolation is real, and everyone knows everyone. Where the economy depends on the sea. Where families have lived for generations. Where outsiders are noticed immediately. The town sits at the mouth of a river that empties into the ocean, surrounded by dense pine forests and rocky coastline. In December, the landscape is brutal. Temperatures drop below zero. Ice forms along the shore. The wind off the water cuts through clothing like a knife. It's beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. And it's the kind of place where people rely on each other to survive the winter. The Harmon family lived on the northern edge of town, in a 2-story colonial home overlooking a stretch of empty coastline. The house was large by Elk River standards. White clapboard siding, black shutters, a wide front porch with a view of the water. It sat on 2 acres of land, surrounded by pine trees. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. Robert Harmon was 46 years old. He ran a successful commercial fishing operation, one of the largest in the area. He owned 3 boats and employed about a dozen men. He was well respected in the community, hard-working, fair, the kind of man people looked up to. His wife Ellen was 42. She managed the town's only bookstore, a small shop on Main Street that also sold newspapers, stationery, and local crafts. She was active in the community. She organized book clubs. She volunteered at the library. She was warm, friendly, someone people genuinely liked. Their 2 sons, Daniel and Kyle, were home for winter break. Daniel was 17, a senior in high school. Kyle was 15, a sophomore. Both were good students. Both played hockey. Both were planning to stay in Elk River after graduation, to work with their father in the fishing business. On Christmas morning, 1997, a neighbor named Thomas Reed was driving past the Harmon property on his way to his sister's house for breakfast. It was around 8:30 a.m. The road was quiet. Most people were home with their families, opening presents, drinking coffee, enjoying the holiday. Thomas noticed the Harmon's front door standing open. Snow had drifted into the entryway. The storm door was also open, swinging slightly in the wind. That wasn't right. Thomas pulled into the driveway. He got out of his truck. He called out. No answer. He walked up to the porch. He called out again. Still nothing. He stepped inside. The entryway was cold. The heat was on, He could hear the furnace running, but the open door had let in the freezing air. He called out Robert's name. Ellen's. The boys. Silence. He walked into the living room. Furniture overturned. Cushions on the floor. A lamp broken. Drawers pulled open. It looked like a tornado had gone through. Then he walked into the kitchen. Robert Harmon was on the floor, face down, in front of the refrigerator. Blood pooled around his head. Thomas didn't need to check for a pulse. He knew. He backed out of the house and called 911 from his truck. Elk River had a small police force, a chief and 3 full-time officers. They arrived within 10 minutes. Chief Warren Bishop entered the house with Officer Dale Harris. What they found was a scene of unimaginable violence. Robert Harmon shot once in the back of the head, close range, execution style. Ellen Harmon in the kitchen as well, near the sink. Shot once in the head. Same method. Daniel and Kyle. Upstairs, in the hallway between their bedrooms. Both shot. Same method. Close range. No chance to run. 4 people. An entire family. Dead. The Maine State Police were called immediately. The Elk River Police Department didn't have the resources to handle a quadruple homicide. State Police Major Crimes Unit detectives arrived by late morning. They secured the scene. They called in forensic technicians. They began processing what would become one of the most complex murder investigations in Maine history. At first glance, the scene told a clear story. A break-in. A robbery. A confrontation that turned deadly. The front door had been forced open from the outside. The lock was damaged. The wood around the frame was splintered, consistent with someone using a pry bar or similar tool. Classic signs of forced entry. The house had been ransacked. The living room was a mess. Drawers pulled open in the kitchen. Upstairs bedrooms searched. It looked like someone had been looking for valuables, cash, jewelry, anything they could take quickly. But investigators immediately noticed inconsistencies. The home security system, a high-end model installed just 6 months earlier by a company out of Portland, had been deactivated. Not triggered. Not bypassed. Deactivated. From the inside. Using a code. The system's digital logs, stored on a hard drive in the basement, showed that the alarm had been turned off at 9:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, roughly 30 minutes before the estimated time of death. Only 4 people had access to that code. The 4 members of the Harmon family. This wasn't a stranger breaking in and triggering an alarm. This was someone they knew. Someone they'd let inside. Someone who'd been given the code, or who'd learned it by watching. The ransacking, upon closer inspection, looked staged. Valuables that should have been taken. Ellen's jewelry box, sitting in plain sight on the bedroom dresser, were untouched. Robert's wallet, with over $200 in cash, was still in his coat pocket hanging by the front door. A flat-screen television. A stereo system. All still there. The items that had been moved, the overturned furniture, the pulled-out drawers, weren't consistent with someone searching methodically. They were consistent with someone trying to create the appearance of a search. The murders themselves told a different story. 4 executions. Close range. Methodical. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was planned. Controlled. Someone had entered the house with the intent to kill everyone inside. State police detectives began interviewing the Harmon's friends, family, and business associates. They built a timeline. They looked for enemies. They looked for anyone who might have had a motive. Robert Harmon was well liked, but he was also a businessman. He'd had disputes with other fishermen over territory. He'd fired employees who weren't pulling their weight. He'd turned down loan requests from people in town who were struggling financially. But none of those disputes seemed serious enough to lead to murder. Ellen had no known enemies. She was universally liked. The bookstore was a community fixture. She had no financial troubles, no personal conflicts that anyone was aware of. The boys were teenagers. They had friends. They played sports. They had no criminal involvement, no gang affiliations, no reason anyone would target them. The investigation turned toward people who'd been inside the Harmon home, who knew the family well enough to have learned the security code. Who had the access? Who had the opportunity? The detectives compiled a list. Friends who'd visited recently. Family members. Contractors who'd done work on the house over the past year. One name kept coming up. Dennis Croft. Dennis Croft was a local carpenter, 41 years old, born and raised in Elk River. He'd worked in construction his entire adult life. Framing, finish work, repairs, renovations. He was skilled, reliable. People hired him because he did good work at a fair price. In the summer of 1997, Croft had done work for the Harmons. He built a new deck on the back of the house. He'd repaired some water damage in the basement. He'd been there for several weeks, off and on, between June and August. He'd worked closely with Robert. Ellen had made him lunch a few times. The boys had helped carry materials. Croft had been inside the house multiple times. He'd seen how they lived. He'd seen where they kept things. He'd had access to nearly every room. Detectives brought Croft in for questioning on December 27th. He agreed to come voluntarily. He seemed shocked by the news of the murders. He said he hadn't heard. He'd been visiting family in New Hampshire over Christmas and had just returned. "Where were you on Christmas Eve?" Croft said he'd been at his girlfriend's house in Bangor, about an hour south of Elk River. Her name was Sandra Mills. They'd had dinner, watched a movie. He'd stayed the night. He'd driven back to Elk River on Christmas afternoon. Detectives contacted Sandra Mills. She confirmed Croft's alibi. He'd been with her. He'd arrived around 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve. He'd left around noon on Christmas Day. The timeline didn't work. The Harmons had been killed around 10:15 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Croft couldn't have been in Elk River if he was in Bangor. But forensic evidence started to tell a different story. Fiber analysis of the crime scene revealed tiny fragments of material collected from multiple locations: the kitchen floor, the upstairs hallway, near the front door. The fragments included wood dust and paint flakes. The wood dust particles were analyzed under a scanning electron microscope. They were identified as treated pine, a specific type commonly used in deck construction. The treatment chemical matched a brand called Weather Seal, used to protect outdoor wood from moisture and rot. The paint flakes were analyzed as well. They were an exterior stain, a custom color called Coastal Gray. The brand was Barn Coat, a premium product sold primarily in New England. Detectives cross-referenced these findings with the work Dennis Croft had done for the Harmons. The deck he'd built was constructed from Weather Seal treated pine. The stain he'd used was Barn Coat Coastal Gray, but the fibers were fresh, not residual from months-old construction work. They'd been deposited recently. Within hours of the murders, detectives obtained a warrant to search Croft's property, his home, his workshop, his vehicle. Inside his truck, a white Ford F-150, they found more fibers, wood dust, paint flakes, consistent with the samples found at the crime scene. They also found a receipt, dated November 28, 1997, from a locksmith in Portland, for a key duplication service, $15. When questioned, Croft claimed it was for a key to a storage unit he rented on the outskirts of town. He said he'd needed a spare. Detectives followed up. The storage facility, a small operation with about 30 units, had no record of Dennis Croft renting a space. The key Croft had in his possession didn't match any of the locks at the facility. A second, more thorough search of Croft's property led to a critical discovery. In his garage, hidden in a false compartment built into the workbench, investigators found stolen goods, not from the Harmons, from other homes, other families. A marine radio, serial number traced to a fishing boat out of Rockland. Electronics, tools, small, valuable items, the kind that could be moved discreetly, sold privately, and wouldn't be immediately missed. Dennis Croft had been running a quiet theft operation for years. He worked as a carpenter. He gained access to people's homes. He learned where they kept valuable items. And then later, he came back. Detectives re-interviewed people Croft had worked for over the past 3 years. Several reported items going missing after Croft had completed jobs. A laptop, a camera, power tools. But no one had reported it to the police. They'd assumed they'd misplaced the items. or they hadn't wanted to accuse someone without proof. But Robert Harmon had figured it out. Under interrogation, confronted with the mounting evidence, Croft's story began to unravel. He admitted that in late November, Robert Harmon had confronted him. A piece of equipment, an expensive marine radio, had gone missing from Robert's boat. It was the same radio later found in Croft's garage. Robert had suspected Croft. He didn't have proof, but he'd warned Croft to stay away from his property. He'd told Croft that if he found out for certain, he'd go to the police. Croft panicked. If Robert went to the police, everything would collapse. His reputation, his business, his entire life in Elk River. People would look back at every job he'd done. They'd realize he'd been stealing from them. He'd go to prison. He couldn't let that happen. During the summer, while working on the deck, Croft had watched Ellen enter the security code for the alarm system. He'd memorized it. He'd also made a copy of the Harmon's front door key. He'd used a portable key mold, a simple device available online that creates an impression of a key in soft material. He'd pressed the key into the mold during a lunch break when the Harmons weren't looking. Later, he'd taken the mold to a locksmith and had a duplicate made. On Christmas Eve, Croft drove to Bangor to establish his alibi. He had dinner with Sandra Mills. He watched a movie. Then, around 9 p.m., he told her he wasn't feeling well. He said he needed to go home. Sandra didn't think much of it. She was disappointed, but she understood. Croft drove north. It took him about an hour to reach Elk River. He parked his truck a half-mile from the Harmon house, on a dirt logging road that ran through the woods. He walked the rest of the way. He used the key to enter through the front door. He deactivated the alarm using the code he'd memorized. The house was quiet. The Harmons were getting ready for bed. He found Robert first. In the kitchen. Croft had brought a .22 caliber handgun. Small. Quiet. What? He shot Robert in the back of the head. Ellen heard the shot. She came into the kitchen. He shot her. The boys were upstairs. They'd heard their mother scream. They came into the hallway. Croft shot them both. 4 people. 4 shots. It was over in minutes. Then he staged the scene. He forced the front door from the inside to make it look like someone had smashed their way in. He overturned furniture. He pulled out drawers. He scattered items to create the appearance of a robbery. And then he left. He walked back to his truck. He drove to a rest stop on Interstate 95 and wiped down the gun. He disassembled it and threw the pieces into a dumpster. Then he drove back to Bangor. He arrived at Sandra's house around 1 a.m. He told her he'd felt better and decided to come back. She let him in. They went to bed. In the morning, he acted surprised when she mentioned wanting to drive up to Elk River for Christmas dinner. He suggested they stay in Bangor instead. She agreed. Dennis Croft was arrested on January 12, 1998. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. At trial, the prosecution presented the forensic evidence. The fibers, the wood dust, the paint flakes, the key, the stolen goods. They presented the digital logs from the security system. They presented testimony from the locksmith who duplicated the key. They presented Sandra Mills, who testified that Croft had left her house for several hours on Christmas Eve. Croft's defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the fibers could have been left during the summer when he'd worked on the house, that the key could have been for something else, that the stolen goods had no direct connection to the Harmons. But the jury didn't buy it. On November 3, 1998, Dennis Croft was convicted on all 4 counts. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated at the Maine State Prison in Warren. In post-conviction interviews, Croft maintained that he didn't have a choice, that Robert Harmon was going to destroy his life, that he'd acted out of survival. He never expressed remorse for Ellen, for Daniel and Kyle, for the 2 teenage boys who were simply in the wrong place. The Harmon home was sold in 1999. The new owners, a family from out of state, have no connection to the tragedy. But every Christmas Eve, locals say they avoid driving past the house after dark. Not out of superstition, but out of respect and discomfort. The case remains a stark reminder in Elk River. of how trust can be weaponized, how someone who's been inside your home, who's eaten at your table, who's shaken your hand, can return in the dark with the worst of intentions. Dennis Croft wasn't a stranger breaking in. He was the carpenter they'd hired, the man they'd trusted, the one who'd helped build their deck, learned their routines, memorized their security code, and then used all of that knowledge to destroy their lives. The people of Elk River don't talk about him much anymore, but his name is still a warning, a lesson that danger doesn't always force its way in. Sometimes you open the door yourself. The Snowshoe Killer. The remote isolation of the Black Hills. Winter 1985. The Black Hills region near Keystone, South Dakota, a vast, desolate wilderness of pine forests, granite peaks, and snow-covered valleys that stretch for hundreds of square miles. This isn't the gentle, picturesque winter of holiday postcards. This is isolation in its most brutal form. Temperatures that drop to 20 below zero. Snowfall measured in feet, not inches. Wind that howls through the mountains, like something alive. The Black Hills have always been remote, but in winter, they become nearly inaccessible. Roads close. Small towns shrink to skeleton populations. The few people who remain, rangers, caretakers, the occasional winter enthusiast, live in a world of silence and cold. It's beautiful, and it's unforgiving. Between Thanksgiving and New Year's of 1985, 3 people disappeared in the Black Hills. 3 separate incidents. 3 individuals who had no apparent connection to each other. And 3 cases that would eventually reveal one of the most disturbing patterns in South Dakota criminal history. The first disappearance occurred on November 29, 1985, the day after Thanksgiving. Michael Brennan was a wildlife photographer from Minneapolis, 34 years old, experienced outdoorsman. He'd come to the Black Hills specifically to photograph winter landscapes and elk herds. He'd rented a small cabin near Deerfield Lake, about 20 miles southwest of Hills City. The cabin was remote, accessible only by a dirt road that became treacherous in winter. No neighbors within 5 miles. No phone line. Just a wood stove, a propane tank, and the kind of solitude that photographers pay for. Michael had told friends he'd be back in Minneapolis by December 5th. When he didn't return, and didn't call, his roommate contacted the Pennington County Sheriff's Office. A deputy drove out to the cabin on December 7th. Michael's rental car was still there, covered in snow. The cabin was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal. His camera equipment was there, his clothing, his food supplies. But no Michael. Search and rescue teams were deployed. They searched the area around the cabin. They searched the trails. They searched Deerfield Lake. Nothing. Nothing. No body. No signs of struggle. No indication of where Michael Brennan had gone. The assumption was that he'd gone out to photograph wildlife and gotten lost. The terrain was disorienting in winter. Landmarks disappeared under snow. It was easy to lose your bearings, especially if a storm rolled in. Search teams believed they'd find his body when the snow melted in spring. But then the second disappearance happened. December 10th, 1985. Sarah Dominguez was a graduate student from Boulder, Colorado, 28 years old. She was working on her master's thesis in environmental science, studying winter ecology in high-altitude forests. She'd been staying at a remote research cabin operated by the Forest Service, located in a drainage basin northeast of Custer State Park. The cabin was even more isolated than Michael Brennan's, accessible only by snowmobile or cross-country skis. She'd planned to stay through mid-December, collecting data on snow depth, animal tracks, and winter vegetation patterns. Sarah had a scheduled radio check-in with the Forest Service office in Custer every 3 days. On December 13th, she missed her check-in. The Forest Service sent a ranger to investigate. The cabin was empty. Sarah's research equipment was inside. Her journals. Why? Her winter gear, coat, boots, gloves were hanging by the door. Her snowmobile was parked outside, covered in fresh snow. But Sarah was gone. Again, search teams were deployed. Again, they found nothing. 2 disappearances in less than 2 weeks, both in remote areas of the Black Hills, both involving people who were experienced in winter conditions, both with no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened. The Pennington County Sheriff's Office began considering the possibility that the cases were connected, but there was no evidence linking them. Michael and Sarah didn't know each other. They were staying in different areas, more than 30 miles apart. There was no obvious motive, no clear pattern. And then a third disappearance occurred. December 28, 1985. Thomas Ellison was a park ranger from Nebraska, 41 years old. He'd taken a week of vacation to go winter hiking in the Black Hills. He was staying at a rustic cabin near Roubaix Lake, in the northwestern section of the Black Hills National Forest. Thomas was former military. He'd served in Alaska. He knew how to survive in extreme cold. He wasn't someone who made mistakes. Thomas had told his supervisor he'd be back on January 2nd. When he didn't return and didn't call, his supervisor contacted authorities. A sheriff's deputy and a Forest Service ranger went to the cabin on January 4th, 1986. Thomas's truck was there. The cabin was locked, but they had a master key. Inside, Thomas's belongings were neatly arranged. His pack, his winter gear, his food at home. But Thomas was gone. 3 disappearances, 3 remote cabins, 3 experienced individuals who knew how to handle winter conditions, and no bodies. The South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation took over. They assembled a task force. They brought in trackers, search dogs, and helicopter support when weather allowed. They began treating the cases as potential homicides, though they had no bodies and no crime scenes. The breakthrough came from something small, something most people would have missed. During the search for Thomas Ellison, a Forest Service ranger named Dale Hutchins noticed something odd near the cabin. Tracks in the snow. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks. Snowshoe tracks. Snowshoes leave a distinctive impression. A wide, elongated print with a mesh pattern from the frame and webbing. Most commercial snowshoes have a standard design. The tracks near Thomas's cabin didn't match standard patterns. Dale Hutchins had spent 20 years in the Black Hills. He knew snowshoe tracks. These were different. The frame was narrower. The webbing pattern was unusual, tighter, more densely woven, and the size was smaller than typical adult snowshoes. He photographed the tracks. He called it in. Investigators went back to the other 2 disappearance sites, Michael Brennan's cabin near Deerfield Lake and Sarah Dominguez's research cabin near Custer. The snow around those sites had been disturbed by search teams, but in the outlying areas, where searchers hadn't walked, they found similar tracks. The same unusual snowshoe prints, leading to all 3 cabins, and leading away. This changed everything. These weren't accidents. These weren't people getting lost in the wilderness. Someone had been there. Someone had tracked these individuals. Someone had used snowshoes to travel through terrain that would have been nearly impassable on foot. The task force brought in a forensic podiatrist, a specialist who analyzes footwear and gait patterns. The snowshoe tracks were photographed, measured, and analyzed. The specialist determined that the snowshoes were likely custom-made or significantly modified from a commercial design. The gait pattern suggested someone who was highly experienced in winter travel. Smooth, efficient strides, no signs of struggle or exhaustion, even in deep snow. But who? Investigators began compiling a list of people who lived or worked in the Black Hills during winter. Rangers, caretakers, trappers, hunting guides. People who had the skills, the equipment, and the access to move through the backcountry undetected. One name kept appearing in the background of the investigation. Frank Hauser. Frank Hauser was 53 years old. He'd worked as a wilderness ranger for the Forest Service for over 20 years. He managed a remote ranger station in the northern Black Hills, near the Wyoming border. His station was little more than a cabin with a radio, no electricity, no running water. It was one of the most isolated postings in the entire National Forest System. Most rangers considered it a hardship assignment. Frank Hauser had requested it. He lived there year-round, alone. His job was to monitor backcountry activity, maintain trails, and assist lost hikers. But in winter, there was almost no activity. Hardly anyone ventured into that section of the Black Hills between November and March. Frank Hauser spent months at a time without seeing another human being. He was known as the guide among the few people who interacted with him. He knew the Black Hills better than anyone. He could navigate in whiteout conditions. He could track animals over bare rock. He was respected, but he was also strange, quiet, uncomfortable around people. He rarely came into town. When he did, he didn't socialize. He bought supplies and left. Detectives learned that Frank Hauser had known about all 3 victims. He'd been in radio contact with Sarah Dominguez. She'd checked in with his station as part of her research protocol. He filed a report about Michael Brennan's rental car being spotted on a Forest Service road. And Thomas Ellison had stopped at Hauser's station briefly in late December to get trail information. Hauser had access. He had knowledge. He had the skills. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Frank Hauser's ranger station. It was a difficult operation. The station was 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by snowmobile in winter. A team of investigators, accompanied by armed officers, made the journey on February 2nd, 1986. Frank Hauser was there when they arrived. He seemed surprised but not alarmed. He was cooperative. He invited them inside. The station was small. One main room with a wood stove, a cot, a table, and shelves stocked with canned food and equipment. A back room used for storage. Everything was meticulously organized, clean, almost obsessively tidy. Investigators searched the main room. They found Hauser's ranger gear, radios, maps, field guides, standard equipment, nothing unusual. Then they searched the back room, and they found the snowshoes. Custom-made, narrow frame, tight webbing, exactly matching the tracks found at all 3 disappearance sites. The bindings showed recent use, wear patterns, small amounts of pine sap stuck to the webbing. They also found personal items, a wallet belonging to Michael Brennan, a necklace belonging to Sarah Dominguez, a watch belonging to Thomas Ellison. And beneath the floorboards, hidden in a shallow space dug out of the earth, they found more. Clothing, identification cards, jewelry, items from at least 6 other individuals, people who'd gone missing in the Black Hills over the past 8 years. Cases that had been classified as accidental deaths or lost hikers, cases that had never been solved. Frank Hauser didn't resist arrest. He sat calmly at his table while investigators processed the scene. When they asked him about the items, he said nothing. He invoked his right to remain silent. But over the following weeks, under interrogation, and with the weight of the evidence against him, Frank Hauser began to talk. He described a pattern that had been going on for nearly a decade. He would monitor radio traffic. He would track the movements of people staying in remote cabins. He knew when they were alone. He knew when they were vulnerable. He would approach at night. Using his snowshoes, he could move silently through the forest. He would watch, wait, and when the moment was right, he would enter the cabin. Most people didn't lock their doors in the backcountry. There was an unspoken trust among winter visitors. They believed they were safe in the isolation. Hauser would overpower them. He was strong, experienced. He knew how to subdue someone quickly and quietly. He would kill them, usually by strangulation or blunt force trauma, and then he would take their bodies into the wilderness, deep into the forest, to places no one would ever search. He would bury them in ravines, cover them with snow and rocks, leave them where they'd never be found. Then he would return to the cabin. He would stage the scene to look like the person had simply left. He'd take small personal items, trophies, and hide them at his station. Why did he do it? Hauser's explanation was chilling in its simplicity. He said the people were intruders, that they didn't belong in the Black Hills, that the wilderness was his domain, and they were trespassing. He said the isolation had given him clarity, that he'd realized he had the power to decide who stayed and who didn't, that the winter provided perfect cover. Bodies would be lost under snow, preserved by cold, and by the time spring came, they'd be scavenged by animals or buried too deep to ever be discovered. He described the killings in calm, detached language. He showed no remorse, no emotion. He referred to his victims as problems that he'd corrected. Investigators spent months searching the areas Hauser identified. They found remains, scattered bones, fragments of clothing, enough to confirm the identities of Michael Brennan, Sarah Dominguez, and Thomas Ellison. They also found remains of others, hikers, researchers, even a trapper who'd gone missing in 1979. Frank Hauser was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. At trial, the prosecution presented the physical evidence, the snowshoes, the personal items, the remains recovered from the wilderness. They presented forensic analysis linking the snowshoe tracks to Hauser. They presented testimony from fellow rangers who described Hauser's intimate knowledge of the backcountry and his increasingly antisocial behavior over the years. The defense argued that Hauser was mentally ill, that years of isolation had broken his mind, that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury didn't agree. On November 14th, 1986, Frank Hauser was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at the South Dakota State Penitentiary in Sioux Falls. He's now in his 90s. He rarely speaks to anyone. He's never expressed remorse. The Forest Service decommissioned Hauser's ranger station in 1987. The cabin still stands, but it's been stripped of all equipment. It's not used. It's marked on internal maps as inactive. Rangers avoid it. The families of the victims have never fully recovered. Many of them had believed their loved ones had simply gotten lost. An accident, a tragedy, but not malice. Learning the truth was, in some ways, worse. The idea that someone had been out there, watching, waiting, hunting. It changed how they thought about wilderness, about isolation, about trust. The Black Hills are still beautiful, still remote, still wild. But for those who know the story of Frank Hauser, there's a shadow over the landscape, a reminder that isolation cuts both ways, that the quiet can hide more than just the sound of wind through the pines, and that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't an animal. It's the person you'd never suspect. The ranger, the guide, the one who knows the wilderness better than anyone else. The socially suspicious murders in Appalachian Milltown, December 2003 and December 2004. Harmony Creek, North Carolina. A declining mill town tucked into the Appalachian foothills, about 40 miles west of Greensboro. Population just under 4,000. The kind of place that used to thrive. That used to have jobs, a future, a sense of community pride. But by 2003, Harmony Creek was dying. The textile mill that had been the town's economic heart for over 70 years had closed in 1998. Most of the jobs went overseas. The younger generation left for cities. Charlotte, Raleigh, Atlanta. Anywhere with opportunity. The people who stayed were the ones who couldn't leave, or didn't want to. Older folks. People with roots too deep to pull up. People who'd rather struggle in a familiar place than start over somewhere new. By December 2003, Harmony Creek was a shell of what it had been. Storefronts on Main Street were boarded up. Houses sat empty, paint peeling, yards overgrown. The mill itself, a massive brick complex that had once employed over 800 people, stood vacant, windows broken, graffiti on the walls. It loomed over the town like a monument to better days. But people still lived there. They still celebrated Christmas. They still tried to hold on to traditions, even as everything around them crumbled. On December 27th, 2003, a woman named Rebecca Stills was found dead in her home. Rebecca was 36 years old. She lived alone in a small house on Maple Ridge Road, on the eastern edge of town. She worked as a cashier at the local grocery store, one of the few businesses still operating in Harmony Creek. She was quiet, private. She didn't have many close friends, but she was friendly enough. She attended church occasionally. She kept to herself. In mid-December, Rebecca had hosted a small holiday gathering at her house. Nothing elaborate. Just a few people from work, a couple of neighbors, some folks from church, maybe a dozen people total. Drinks, snacks, conversation. It was the kind of low-key gathering that people in small towns do out of obligation as much as desire. On the morning of December 27th, Rebecca didn't show up for her shift at the grocery store. Her manager tried calling. No answer. By the afternoon, concerned, the manager asked a coworker to drive by Rebecca's house and check on her. The coworker found the front door unlocked. She called out. No response. She stepped inside. Rebecca was in the living room, on the couch, strangled. A lamp cord had been used as the ligature, still wrapped around her neck. Her body had been positioned carefully, sitting upright, hands folded in her lap. The room was neat, undisturbed. No signs of a struggle. The Caldwell County Sheriff's Office responded. Detectives processed the scene. The medical examiner estimated the time of death at some time late on December 26th, likely between 10 p.m. and midnight. There was no forced entry, no valuables taken, no signs of sexual assault. The house was clean. The only disturbance was Rebecca's body. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd attended Rebecca's holiday gathering. They compiled a list of names. They asked who else had been there, who had stayed late, who might have had access to the house afterward. The problem was that no one could agree on exactly who'd been there. It was a casual gathering. People came and went. Some brought friends. Some left early. No one had kept track. And when detectives asked specific questions, did you see this person there? Did you talk to them? The answers were vague, evasive, inconsistent. It was a small town. People knew each other, but they also protected each other. There was an insularity to Harmony Creek, a collective resistance to outsiders, and that included law enforcement from the county seat. Detectives sensed they weren't getting the full story. People were holding back, whether out of fear, loyalty, or suspicion. It was hard to say. The investigation stalled, and then, almost exactly 1 year later, it happened again. December 23rd, 2004. Angela Pruitt was found dead in her home. Angela was 41 years old. She lived alone in a small house on Birch Street, about half a mile from Rebecca Still's former residence. She worked part-time at the Harmony Creek post office. Like Rebecca, she was quiet, private. She'd also hosted a small holiday gathering earlier in December. A handful of people, casual, nothing fancy. Angela's body was discovered by her sister, who'd come by to drop off a Christmas gift. The front door was unlocked. Angela was in the kitchen, strangled this time. The ligature was a length of electrical cord, wrapped around her neck. Her body had been positioned sitting in a chair at the kitchen table, hands folded, head slumped forward. Again, no forced entry, no valuables taken, no signs of sexual assault. The house was undisturbed. The similarities were undeniable. Two single women, both living alone, both in Harmony Creek, both killed in their homes in December, just after hosting small holiday gatherings, both strangled, both positioned. The Caldwell County Sheriff's Office called in the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. A task force was formed. Detectives began cross-referencing the guest lists from both holiday parties, looking for overlap. There was overlap. Several people had attended both gatherings. But again, no one could provide clear, consistent information about who else had been there. Memories were fuzzy. Details contradicted. It was as if the entire town had collectively decided not to remember. Investigators began to suspect that someone in Harmony Creek, someone local, someone familiar, was using the holiday social scene to identify targets and gain access to their homes. The killer wasn't a stranger. The killer was integrating into the community, blending in, attending gatherings, building trust, and then returning later when the victims were alone and vulnerable. Detectives focused on people who'd been present at both parties. They compiled a list of about 20 individuals. They interviewed each one. They checked alibis. They looked for red flags, prior arrests, history of violence, suspicious behavior. One name kept appearing in the background: Jerry Vance. Jerry Vance was 47 years old. He'd lived in Harmony Creek his entire life. He worked maintenance at the old textile mill, or rather, he used to, before it closed. After the closure, he'd done odd jobs around town: repairs, janitorial work, whatever people needed. He was quiet, unremarkable. People knew him, but not well. He was the kind of person who was always around but never quite in focus. He'd attended both Rebecca Still's gathering and Angela Pruitt's gathering. He'd been invited by other guests. He wasn't close friends with either woman, but he was known to them. He was part of the social periphery, the kind of person you invite because it would be rude not to. Detectives brought Jerry Vance in for questioning. He was cooperative, calm. He confirmed he'd been to both gatherings. He said he'd stay for an hour or so at each, had a drink, talked to a few people, then left. He said he barely knew Rebecca or Angela. He was sorry about what had happened, but he had nothing to do with it. Where were you on the nights they were killed? Home, alone, watching television. No one could verify it. He lived by himself in a small rental house on the south side of town. Detectives had no physical evidence linking Vance to the crimes. No witnesses placing him at the victims' homes after the parties. No clear motive. They released him. But then, forensic analysis came back, and everything changed. At both crime scenes, investigators had collected trace evidence: fibers, hair, dust, anything that might provide a lead. The fibers were sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Among the fibers collected from Angela Pruitt's kitchen, forensic technicians found a single thread. It was dark blue, synthetic, with a unique weave pattern. When analyzed and compared against textile databases, the thread was identified as coming from a specific type of work uniform: industrial coveralls manufactured by a company called Duroware. Duroware coveralls had been standard issue for maintenance workers at the Harmony Creek textile mill. The mill had ordered them in bulk, custom-made with the mill's logo embroidered on the chest. After the mill closed, many of the remaining workers had kept their uniforms. They were durable, useful for dirty work. But the key detail was this: the thread found at Angela Pruitt's house didn't come from the uniform itself. It came from a repair kit. Duroware had provided each maintenance worker with a small sewing kit for on-the-job repairs: specific thread, needles, patches. The thread in the kit was a slightly different shade and weave than the thread used in the uniforms themselves, designed for durability and easy stitching. Only maintenance workers at the mill had been given those kits. Detectives went back through their list of people who'd attended both parties. Only one person fit the profile: Jerry Vance. He'd been a maintenance worker at the mill. He would have had one of those repair kits. A second search warrant was obtained for Vance's home. Detectives executed it on January 14th, 2005. Inside Vance's house, they found the coveralls, the Duroware uniform, still hanging in his closet. And in a drawer in the bedroom, they found the repair kit. The spool of thread inside matched the fiber found at Angela Pruitt's house. They also found something else: a small cardboard box tucked under the bed. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, taken at social gatherings around Harmony Creek over the past several years. Holiday parties, church picnics, community events. Many of the photos featured women. Some of the women were circled in red ink: Rebecca Stills, Angela Pruitt, Dawes, and others. Jerry Vance was arrested on January 15th, 2005. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Under interrogation, Vance initially denied everything. But when confronted with the thread evidence, the photographs, and the detailed forensic analysis, his story began to fall apart. He admitted that he'd been attending social gatherings specifically to observe women who lived alone. He said he felt invisible, that people in Harmony Creek looked through him, that he'd been discarded when the mill closed, just like everyone else. But somehow it felt worse for him. He said he wanted to be noticed, to be remembered, to matter. He described how he would attend parties, how he would watch, how he would learn routines, who lived alone, who was vulnerable. And then, later, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, he would return. He'd enter through unlocked doors or windows. Most people in Harmony Creek didn't lock their doors. It was a small town. People trusted each other. That trust made it easy. He would strangle them quickly, quietly. Then he would position their bodies. He wanted them to look peaceful, dignified. He said he wasn't trying to degrade them. He said he was giving them a moment of stillness in a chaotic world. When asked about the photographs, about the women circled in red, Vance said those were women he was considering, women he was watching, planning for. Jerry Vance was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in October 2005. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated at the Polk Correctional Institution in North Carolina. The people of Harmony Creek were devastated, not just by the murders, but by the realization that someone they'd known for decades, someone they'd invited into their homes, someone they'd trusted, had been hunting among them. The town became even more insular after Vance's arrest. People stopped hosting gatherings. They stopped trusting strangers. They stopped trusting each other. Harmony Creek's population has continued to decline. By 2010, fewer than 3,000 people lived there. The mill was demolished in 2012. Most of the remaining businesses have closed. But the memory of Jerry Vance remains. A reminder that danger doesn't always come from outside. That sometimes, the most dangerous person is the one you've known your whole life. The one you never really noticed. The one you invited to your holiday party because it would have been rude not to. And that's the most unsettling truth of all. That, in a small town, where everyone knows everyone, the person you trust might be the one you should fear the most. The Santa Anomaly. The Psychological Choices of the Ohio River Stalker. December 1974, Portsmouth, Ohio. A declining industrial town perched on the northern bank of the Ohio River, right at the Kentucky border. Population, around 25,000. Once, Portsmouth had been a thriving manufacturing hub. Steel mills, shoe factories, railroad yards. But by the 1970s, the decline had already begun. Factories were closing. Jobs were disappearing. The optimism of the post-war boom had given way to economic anxiety and social decay. The town had a worn, forgotten quality. Rows of brick houses with peeling paint, empty storefronts, bars that opened early and closed late. It was the kind of place where people worked hard, lived modestly, and tried not to think too much about the future. Christmas in Portsmouth was still observed, but with less enthusiasm than in previous decades. People decorated out of habit more than joy. The holiday season felt hollow, performative, a reminder of better times that weren't coming back. On December 18, 1974, a woman named Dorothy Kemp was found dead in her home. Dorothy was 53 years old. She lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house on Chillicothe Street, a quiet residential area about 10 blocks from downtown. She worked as a secretary at a law office. She was reliable, punctual, well-liked. She had adult children who lived out of state. She attended church every Sunday. She was, by all accounts, a completely ordinary person. Her body was discovered by a neighbor, a woman named Edna Walsh, who'd stopped by to return a casserole dish. The front door was unlocked. Edna walked in and found Dorothy in the living room, lying on the couch, strangled. The ligature appeared to be a length of thin rope or cord. Dorothy's body had been positioned on her back, arms at her sides, legs straight. She looked almost peaceful. But there was something else. Something that made Edna Walsh recoil in confusion and horror. On Dorothy's chest, placed carefully over her sternum, was a small Santa Claus figurine. Cheap plastic, about 3 inches tall, the kind you'd buy at a 5-and-dime store for $1. Santa's painted smile was chipped. One of his hands was broken off. Edna called the police. Portsmouth police detective Raymond Cross responded. He was in his early 50s, a veteran investigator who'd worked homicides for over 20 years. He'd seen a lot, but this was different. The scene was controlled. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing taken. And the Santa figurine, sitting there on the victim's chest like some kind of grotesque Christmas ornament. The medical examiner estimated the time of death at late the previous evening, December 17th, between 10 p.m. and midnight. The ligature marks suggested a thin, woven cord, possibly clothesline or nylon rope. Detectives interviewed Dorothy's friends, family, and coworkers. No one could think of anyone who'd want to hurt her. She had no enemies, no financial troubles, no romantic entanglements, no history of conflict with neighbors. She was quiet, predictable, safe. The investigation focused on the Santa figurine. Where had it come from? Was it Dorothy's? What? Her neighbors said she decorated modestly for Christmas. A small tree, some lights in the window. But they'd never seen her with cheap plastic figurines like that. Detectives theorized it might be a signature. Something the killer left intentionally. A message. But what did it mean? 5 days later, on December 23rd, another call came in. Marilyn Foster was found dead in her home on Waller Street, about a mile and a half from Dorothy Kemp's house. Strangled. The ligature appeared to be a length of thin rope or cord. Dorothy's body had been positioned on her back, arms at her sides, legs straight. She looked almost peaceful. But there was something else. Something that made Edna Walsh recoil in confusion and horror. On Dorothy's chest, placed carefully over her sternum, was a small Santa Claus figurine. Cheap plastic, about 3 inches tall, the kind you'd buy at a 5 and dime store for $1. Santa's painted smile was chipped. One of his hands was broken off. Edna called the police. Portsmouth police detective Raymond Cross responded. He was in his early 50s, a veteran investigator who'd worked homicides for over 20 years. He'd seen a lot, but this was different. The scene was controlled. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing taken. And the Santa figurine, sitting there on the victim's chest like some kind of grotesque Christmas ornament. The medical examiner estimated the time of death at late the previous evening, December 17th, between 10 p.m. and midnight. The ligature marks suggested a thin, woven cord, possibly clothesline or nylon rope. Detectives interviewed Dorothy's friends, family, and coworkers. No one could think of anyone who'd want to hurt her. She had no enemies, no financial troubles, no romantic entanglements, no history of conflict with neighbors. She was quiet, predictable, safe. The investigation focused on the Santa figurine. Where had it come from? Was it Dorothy's? What? Her neighbors said she decorated modestly for Christmas. A small tree, some lights in the window. But they'd never seen her with cheap plastic figurines like that. Detectives theorized it might be a signature. Something the killer left intentionally. A message. But what did it mean? 5 days later, on December 23rd, another call came in. Marilyn Foster was found dead in her home on Waller Street, about a mile and a half from Dorothy Kemp's house. Marilyn was 48 years old. She worked as a nurse at a local clinic. Like Dorothy, she lived alone. Like Dorothy, she was quiet, reliable, well-liked. She had no known enemies. No reason anyone would want to hurt her. Her body was found by her supervisor at the clinic, who'd gone to check on her when she didn't show up for her shift. The front door was unlocked. Marilyn was in her bedroom, lying on the bed, strangled. Same method, same controlled scene. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing taken. And on her chest, positioned carefully, was another Santa figurine, identical to the first. Cheap plastic, painted smile, broken hand out. Detective Cross knew immediately. This was the same killer. 2 women, but both middle-aged, both living alone, both killed in their homes late at night, both strangled, both posed, and both left with a Santa figurine on their chest. The Portsmouth Police Department, a small force with limited resources, requested assistance from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. A task force was assembled. Behavioral specialists were brought in to analyze the scene and the signature. The Santa figurine was the key. It wasn't random. It meant something. Behavioral analysts suggested the killer was using the figurine as a psychological statement. Santa Claus is a symbol of generosity, joy, childhood innocence, and the idealized version of Christmas. Placing a cheap, broken Santa on the victims' bodies could represent several things. A rejection of that idealism, a mockery of holiday commercialism, or a twisted attempt to gift the victims something in death. The fact that the figurines were identical suggested premeditation. The killer had acquired multiple figurines in advance. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. Detectives began canvassing stores in Portsmouth that sold cheap holiday decorations. 5 and dime stores. Discount retailers. Drug stores. They showed photos of the figurine. Several store clerks remembered selling similar items, but no one remembered a specific customer who'd bought multiple Santas. The investigation hit a wall, and then detectives started looking at the victims' routines. What did Dorothy and Marilyn have in common, besides being middle-aged women living alone? They both used the same post office branch, the downtown Portsmouth post office on Gallia Street. It was a small detail, but it was a connection. Detectives began interviewing postal workers. They asked if anyone had noticed unusual behavior. Anyone paying too much attention to female customers, anyone who seemed off. One name came up repeatedly. Eugene Fisk, postal worker, mail carrier, 42 years old. He'd worked for the post office for over 15 years. He was quiet, kept to himself, didn't socialize with coworkers. He had a reputation for being intense and strange, but no one could point to anything specific. Detectives looked into Eugene Fisk's background. He'd never been married. He lived alone in a small apartment on the west side of town. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags. But he fit the profile. Middle-aged, isolated, access to information about residents' addresses through his job, knowledge of routines. Detectives brought Fisk in for questioning on December 30th, 1974. He agreed to come voluntarily. Where were you on the nights of December 17th and December 22nd? Home, alone, watching television, reading. No one could verify it. Did you know Dorothy Kemp or Marilyn Foster? He recognized the names. He might have delivered mail to them. He wasn't sure. He delivered to a lot of houses. Detectives asked if he'd consent to a search of his apartment. Fisk hesitated. Then he asked for a lawyer. That was enough for a warrant. On January 2nd, 1975, investigators executed a search warrant at Eugene Fisk's apartment. What they found was disturbing. The apartment was small, one bedroom, sparsely furnished, but the walls were covered with newspaper clippings, articles about Christmas, advertisements for holiday sales, photos of decorated storefronts, and scattered throughout were handwritten notes, rants about the commercialization of Christmas, about how the holiday had lost its meaning, about how people were fake, greedy, obsessed with material things. In the bedroom closet, investigators found a cardboard box. Inside were Santa figurines, dozens of them. Cheap plastic Santas, identical to the ones found on the victims. Some were still in their original packaging. And beneath the box, hidden under a loose floorboard, they found journals. Pages and pages of handwritten entries, dating back years. Eugene Fisk had been documenting his thoughts about Christmas, about society, about women he encountered on his mail route. The entries were disturbing. Fisk wrote about how Christmas had become a grotesque celebration of consumption, how people pretended to be happy, generous, kind, but were really selfish and empty. He wrote about how he felt invisible, how people looked through him when he delivered their mail, how no one cared about him, but everyone expected him to care about them. He wrote about Dorothy Kemp, about how she'd complained to the post office about a delayed package in November, how she'd been rude, how she'd made him feel incompetent. He wrote about Marilyn Foster, about how she'd ignored him when he'd tried to make conversation while delivering a package, how she'd barely acknowledged his existence. The entries grew darker, more obsessive. He wrote about planning their deaths, about how he would make them still and quiet, how he would leave them with the Santa figurines as a gift, a symbol of the fake, commercial Christmas they all pretended to love. He wrote, "They smile at Santa. They buy the cheap plastic smiles. They put them on shelves and pretend it means something. But it's all empty. Just like them, I'll give them their Santa. I'll give them the stillness they deserve. I'll give them the stillness they deserve." Eugene Fisk was arrested on January 2, 1975. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During interrogation, Fisk confessed. He described how he used his knowledge of the victims' addresses and routines, gained through his work as a mail carrier, to target them. He'd watched their homes. He'd waited until late at night, when he knew they'd be alone. He'd entered through unlocked doors or windows. Most people in Portsmouth didn't lock up carefully. It was a trusting town. He'd strangled them quickly, efficiently. He said he didn't want them to suffer. He just wanted them to be quiet, to stop participating in the charade of Christmas. The Santa figurines, he explained, were his statement, a symbol of everything he hated about the holiday. The fake joy, the forced generosity, the commercialization. He wanted to leave the victims with that symbol, to show that their participation in the holiday farce was meaningless. Eugene Fisk was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in August 1975. He was sentenced to life in prison. He died in 23 at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution from complications related to lung cancer. He never expressed remorse. In his final interview, conducted by a journalist in 21, he said he still believed Christmas was a lie we tell ourselves to avoid facing the emptiness. The case became known as the Santa Anomaly because of the bizarre ritualistic use of the figurines. Behavioral analysts have studied Fisk's journals extensively. They represent a rare example of a killer who left a detailed psychological roadmap of his motives: resentment, isolation, and a deep-seated hatred of societal rituals he felt excluded from. The people of Portsmouth were horrified. The idea that their mail carrier, someone they saw almost every day, someone they trusted, had been watching them, judging them, and ultimately killing them, was almost incomprehensible. The downtown post office where Fisk worked was eventually closed in the 1990s as part of a consolidation effort. The building still stands, but it's been converted into offices. Dorothy Kemp and Marilyn Foster are buried in Green Lawn Cemetery in Portsmouth. Their families have long since moved away. But every December, someone, no one knows who, leaves small wreaths on their graves. Not with Santas, just evergreen and red ribbon. A quiet acknowledgement of lives lost to a man who hated the very holiday they were trying to celebrate. The case is a reminder that the most dangerous people are often the ones we never really see, the ones who blend into the background, the ones who feel invisible, and who, one day, decide they've had enough of being overlooked. The unsolved gift wrap. The collapse of evidence in Silver Falls. December 1991. Silver Falls, Texas, a remote border town on the western corner of the state, about 80 miles southeast of El Paso. Population barely scraping 2,000. The landscape is harsh. Flat desert stretching to distant mountains. Scrub brush. Dust devils spinning across empty roads. Summer temperatures climb past 100 degrees. Winter nights drop below freezing. It's isolated in a way that feels almost alien. The kind of place where the nearest grocery store is 40 miles away, and people measure distance in hours, not miles. Silver Falls exists because of the railroad. A junction point established in the early 1900s. For decades, it survived on cattle ranching and a small factory that processed leather goods. By 1991, the factory had closed. The ranches were struggling. Most young people had left for cities, El Paso, Midland, anywhere with opportunity. The people who remained were the stubborn, the rooted, and the forgotten, the rooted. The town's isolation meant law enforcement was sparse. The nearest Texas Ranger station was over an hour away. The Silver Falls Police Department consisted of a chief and 3 officers. Serious crimes were rare. When they occurred, outside help was needed, and sometimes that help came too late. On December 19th, 1991, 2 bodies were discovered in Silver Falls. Family members, found in separate homes on opposite ends of town. Both killed execution style. Both bound with an unusual type of plastic gift wrap. Not the decorative paper, but actual industrial plastic wrap, the kind used for packaging and shipping. The victims were Thomas Carr, 62, and his nephew, Michael Carr, 38. Thomas lived in a small house on the north side of town, near the old railroad depot. Michael lived in a trailer on the south end, close to the defunct leather factory. They were cattle ranchers. They owned land together, about 800 acres of scrubland used for grazing. They were well known in Silver Falls. Quiet men, hardworking. They kept to themselves but were respected. Thomas's body was found by his housekeeper, a woman named Rosa Delgado, who came by twice a week to clean. She arrived on the morning of December 19th and found the front door ajar. She called out. No answer. She stepped inside and found Thomas in the kitchen, slumped over the table. He'd been shot once in the back of the head. His hands were bound behind his back with thick, clear plastic wrap, layer upon layer, wound tightly around his wrists. Rosa ran outside and flagged down a passing truck. The driver used a CB radio to call for help. Silver Falls Police Chief Martin Hayes responded. He was in his late 50s, a lifelong resident who'd been chief for over 20 years. He'd never worked a homicide. He'd never even seen a murder victim before. He secured the scene as best he could, called the county sheriff, and requested assistance from the Texas Rangers. While Chief Hayes was still at Thomas Carr's house, another call came in. Michael Carr's girlfriend, Jennifer Ortiz, had gone to his trailer to pick him up for lunch. She found him dead, same method, shot in the back of the head, hands bound behind his back with the same type of clear plastic wrap. 2 executions, same day, same family, separated by about 3 miles. Texas Rangers arrived by late afternoon. Lead ranger on the case was Daniel Frost, a veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience. He immediately recognized the complexity. 2 victims, 2 scenes, limited local resources, and a crime that showed signs of planning and execution beyond what you'd expect from local violence. Ranger Frost began coordinating with the local police and the Hudspeth County Sheriff's Office. They established a command post. They processed both crime scenes. But there was a problem, a significant problem. Silver Falls had no trained crime scene technicians. Chief Hayes and his officers had done their best, but they'd made mistakes. At Thomas Carr's house, the plastic wrap binding the victim's wrists had been cut and removed by the responding officers, who checked for a pulse even though Thomas was clearly deceased. The wrap had been placed in a paper bag, but it had been handled without gloves. Fingerprints were smudged. The chain of custody was unclear. At Michael Carr's trailer, the scene had been contaminated by Jennifer Ortiz, who tried to perform CPR despite the obvious gunshot wound. She'd moved the body slightly. She'd touched the plastic wrap. By the time Texas Rangers arrived, the scene had been compromised. The plastic wrap itself was unusual. It wasn't standard household gift wrap. It was industrial-grade stretch film, thick, clear, with high tensile strength. The kind used in warehouses and shipping operations to secure pallets and protect goods during transport. It wasn't something most people would have in their homes. Forensic technicians from El Paso were called in. They attempted to process the wrap for fingerprints, DNA, and trace evidence, but the contamination made analysis difficult. Some prints were recovered, but they were partial and smudged. DNA testing in 1991 was still relatively new and required clean samples. The samples they had were compromised. The investigation focused on motive. Why would someone kill both Thomas and Michael Carr? The most obvious answer was money. Land. The Carr family owned significant acreage in an area where land, despite being harsh and difficult to work, still had value, especially if someone wanted to develop it or consolidate parcels. Detectives learned that the Carrs had been involved in a land dispute. A neighboring rancher, a man named Raymond Cole, had approached them earlier in the year about selling a section of their property. The cars had refused. Cole had been persistent. There had been arguments, harsh words, threats, according to some witnesses. But Raymond Cole had an alibi. On December 18th, the day before the bodies were discovered, he'd been in El Paso attending a livestock auction. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. He'd stayed overnight at a motel and hadn't returned to Silver Falls until the afternoon of the 19th, after the bodies had already been found. Detectives looked at other possibilities. Business disputes, family conflicts, debts, but nothing substantial emerged. The cars were financially stable. They had no known enemies beyond the land dispute. They lived simply, quietly, without drama. The investigations stalled. Months passed. The case went cold. But in 1997, a new development emerged. The cold case was assigned to a regional task force that specialized in unsolved homicides. They had access to better technology, better forensic methods. They decided to re-examine the evidence. The key was the plastic wrap. The few pieces that had been preserved, stored in evidence lockers in El Paso, were subjected to new analysis. Forensic chemists examined the adhesive composition. Most industrial stretch film uses a specific type of adhesive to provide cling and durability. The adhesive can vary slightly depending on the manufacturer. The wrap used to bind the car victims had a unique adhesive signature. It contained trace amounts of a chemical compound called ethylene vinyl acetate, EVA, combined with a proprietary blend of tackifiers. This combination was rare. It was used by only a handful of manufacturers, and within Texas, only one facility produced stretch film with that specific formula. A small family-owned plastics factory in Van Horn, Texas, about 60 miles northeast of Silver Falls. The factory, called Texwrap Industries, had been in operation since the 1970s. It produced industrial plastic wrap and packaging materials for regional distribution. The company employed about 24 people, most of them locals. Detectives traveled to Van Horn. They interviewed the factory owner, a man named Gerald Cole. And that's when the pieces started falling into place. Gerald Cole's son was Raymond Cole, the same Raymond Cole who'd had the land dispute with the Carr family. Raymond Cole had worked night shifts at the Texwrap factory for several years in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He had direct access to the exact type of plastic wrap used to bind the victims. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Raymond Cole's property. By this time, 1997, Cole had moved to a larger ranch outside of Van Horn, having purchased additional land using money from sources that weren't entirely clear. During the search, investigators found rolls of the industrial stretch film in Cole's storage shed. The adhesive composition matched the wrap used in the murders. They also found .38 caliber ammunition, the same caliber used to kill Thomas and Michael Carr. And they found documents, financial records showing that after the Carrs' deaths, Raymond Cole had quietly purchased portions of their land from the estate through intermediaries at below market prices. Raymond Cole was arrested on June 14, 1997, nearly 6 years after the murders. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case that went to trial in 1998 was built on forensic evidence, financial motive, and circumstantial connections. The prosecution argued that Raymond Cole had murdered the Carrs to remove obstacles to a land consolidation plan. He'd used the plastic wrap from his father's factory because it was available, industrial strength, and, he believed, untraceable. The alibi, prosecutors argued, was carefully constructed but not airtight. While Cole had been in El Paso on December 18th, forensic pathologists re-examined the time of death estimates. The original estimates had been broad, sometime between the evening of December 18th and the morning of December 19th. The prosecution presented expert testimony, suggesting the murders could have occurred late on the evening of December 18th, after Cole returned from El Paso, but before the bodies were discovered the next morning. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the plastic wrap, while unusual, could have been obtained by anyone with access to the factory, that the financial transactions were legitimate business dealings, that the time of death window was too uncertain to definitively place Cole at the scenes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On October 7, 1998, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on both counts. Raymond Cole was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated at the McConnell unit in Beeville, Texas. In post-conviction interviews, Cole has consistently maintained his innocence. He claims the evidence was misinterpreted, that he was targeted because of the land dispute, that the real killer was never found. His appeals have been denied multiple times, but investigators who worked the case believe they got the right man. The forensic evidence, while compromised initially, ultimately provided the link. The motive, control of valuable land in a remote area where such disputes could turn deadly, was clear. And the method, execution-style killings designed to send a message and eliminate threats, fit the profile of someone who believed he could act with impunity in an isolated community where law enforcement was limited. The case is often cited in forensic training as an example of how initial investigative failures can jeopardize justice. The contamination of the crime scenes, the mishandling of critical evidence, and the lack of resources in remote jurisdictions all contributed to a 6-year delay in solving the case. If the plastic wrap had been properly preserved and analyzed in 1991, the case might have been solved within months. Silver Falls today is even smaller than it was in 1991. The population has dipped below 1,500. The old railroad depot is abandoned. The Tex Wrap factory closed in 2005 after Gerald Cole retired, and no buyers could be found for the business. The Carr family's ranch was eventually sold off in parcels. No family members remain in the area, but the memory of Thomas and Michael Carr lingers. They're buried in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of town, near the highway. Every December, someone, locals believe it's a distant cousin who still lives in El Paso, places small wreaths on their graves. The case serves as a grim reminder that in remote places, where law enforcement is stretched thin and resources are scarce, killers can believe they're beyond reach. That isolation can be a weapon, and that sometimes justice is delayed not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the systems meant to preserve and analyze it fail at the most critical moment. Raymond Cole took advantage of that failure. He committed murder on the assumption that a small-town police force wouldn't have the capability to solve it. And for 6 years, he was right. It took time, technology, and the determination of investigators who refused to let the case die for the truth to finally surface. But the Carr family waited 6 years for answers. 6 years of not knowing. 6 years of suspicion and rumor. 6 years of watching the man they believed was responsible walk free, consolidate land, and build a life on top of the deaths he'd caused. That's the cost of a collapsed investigation. Not just a delayed conviction, but years of unresolved grief. Years of a killer living among the people he'd victimized, and a scar on a community that never fully heals. The final wish, the emotionally heavy resolution in Greenbrier County, December 25, 1968. Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a rural, mountainous region in the southeastern part of the state. Population scattered across small towns, hollers, and isolated farmsteads. The landscape is beautiful, rolling hills covered in hardwood forests, narrow valleys carved by cold mountain streams. But it's also harsh. Winters are long. Roads are rough. Communities are tight-knit, bound by generations of shared history. Christmas Day in Greenbrier County was sacred. It was the one day of the year when families gathered, when old grievances were set aside, when even the poorest households found a way to make the day special. Church services in the morning, midday dinners that lasted for hours, children playing in the snow while adults sat by wood stoves and told stories. It was supposed to be the safest day of the year, the most peaceful, the day when nothing bad could happen. But on Christmas Day, 1968, something unspeakable occurred. Ernest and Clara Whitmore were found dead in their home. Ernest was 74 years old. Clara was 71. They'd lived in the same small farmhouse on Meadow Creek Road for over 40 years. They were beloved in the community. Ernest had worked as a school teacher before retiring. Clara had been a nurse. After retirement, they devoted themselves to charity work, helping neighbors in need, organizing food drives through their church, visiting elderly shut-ins who had no family nearby. Everyone knew the Whitmores. Everyone loved them. They represented the best of what small-town Appalachia could be: selfless, kind, deeply rooted in their community. Their bodies were discovered late on Christmas afternoon by their pastor, Reverend Thomas Hale, who'd stopped by to deliver a basket of baked goods from the church's Christmas celebration. He knocked on the door. No answer. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was quiet. The Christmas tree was lit. Presents sat unopened beneath it. The smell of ham and roasted vegetables still lingered in the air, as if dinner had been prepared but never eaten. Reverend Hale called out. Silence. He walked through the small living room, into the hallway, and that's when he found them. Ernest and Clara were in their bedroom. Both had been beaten. Brutally. The room was a scene of violence, blood on the walls, on the bedding, on the floor. The attack had been savage, personal, doctrine, rage-filled. Reverend Hale staggered outside and vomited in the front yard. Then he drove to the nearest neighbor's house and called the sheriff. Greenbrier County Sheriff's Office responded. The lead investigator was Deputy William Cross, a man in his early 40s who'd grown up in the county. He knew the Whitmores. Everyone did. Seeing them like that, two elderly, gentle people who'd spent their lives helping others, was almost incomprehensible. The medical examiner arrived from Charleston. The cause of death for both victims was blunt force trauma. They'd been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, likely a piece of firewood or metal implement. The time of death was estimated at mid-morning on Christmas Day, sometime between 10 a.m. and noon. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Clara's jewelry box was untouched. Cash sat in a drawer in the kitchen. Ernest's watch was still on his wrist. The house hadn't been ransacked. This wasn't a robbery. The brutality of the attack suggested something personal. But the Whitmores had no enemies. No one could imagine anyone wanting to hurt them. Investigators canvassed the area. They interviewed neighbors, family members, church members. No one had seen anything suspicious. No unfamiliar vehicles on the road. No strangers in the area. Christmas morning had been quiet, as it always was. People were home with their families. The investigation focused on external threats. Drifters. Escaped prisoners. Someone passing through who might have targeted the Whitmores randomly. But there were no leads. No evidence. No witnesses. The case went cold. For decades, the murder of Ernest and Clara Whitmore haunted Greenbrier County. It was the worst thing that had ever happened there. The idea that two beloved elderly people could be killed in their own home on Christmas Day was a wound that never healed. People stopped leaving their doors unlocked. They stopped trusting strangers. They stopped believing that the holidays were inherently safe. The Whitmores were buried in the cemetery behind Meadow Creek Baptist Church, the same church they'd attended for over 50 years. The funeral was the largest anyone in the county had ever seen. Over 300 people attended. The grief was profound, and so was the anger. People wanted answers. They wanted justice. But as the years passed, it seemed like neither would come. The case file sat in storage. Cold. Unsolved. A painful reminder of a question that couldn't be answered. Who would do this? And why? Then, in 2008, 40 years after the murders, something changed. Advances in DNA technology had made it possible to re-examine old cases. Familial DNA testing, which compares crime scene DNA to profiles in databases and identifies potential relatives of the suspect, had become a powerful investigative tool. The West Virginia State Police reopened the Whitmore case. They retrieved evidence that had been stored since 1968, clothing from the victims, swabs taken from the crime scene, items that had been collected but never fully analyzed with modern techniques. Forensic technicians found biological evidence, semen, recovered from the crime scene. In 1968, DNA testing didn't exist. The sample had been noted in the original reports, but couldn't be analyzed. In 2008, it could be. The DNA was extracted and processed. A profile was created. It was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes across the country. No direct match, but familial DNA testing provided a lead. The profile was similar, though not identical, to a profile in the database belonging to a man named David Riker, who'd been convicted of a minor assault charge in the 1990s. Familial similarity suggested that the person who'd left DNA at the Whitmore crime scene was related to David Riker, likely a parent, sibling, or child. Investigators began looking into David Riker's family. His father, Thomas "Tommy" Riker, was flagged as a person of interest. Thomas Riker was 66 years old and 28. Died. He'd lived in Greenbrier County his entire life. He'd worked various jobs over the years: construction, factory work, eventually disability after a back injury. He had a troubled history: multiple arrests for assault, domestic violence, public intoxication. He'd struggled with anger management and substance abuse for most of his adult life. But in 1968, Thomas Riker had been a teenager, 18 years old, living with his parents in a house less than 2 miles from the Whitmore's farm. Investigators obtained a court order to collect a DNA sample from Thomas Riker. The sample was processed and compared to the DNA from the crime scene. It was a match. Thomas Riker was arrested on November 4th, 2008, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest shocked Greenbrier County. People remembered Tommy Riker from decades ago. He'd been a troubled kid, angry, violent. He'd gotten into fights. He dropped out of school. But no one had ever connected him to the Whitmore murders. During interrogation, Riker initially denied everything. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, and with the weight of 40 years of guilt, he began to break down. He confessed. He described Christmas morning, 1968. He'd been at home with his own family. His father, Tommy's grandfather, was an alcoholic who'd been drinking heavily. There had been an argument, a fight. Tommy's mother had been crying. Tommy, 18 and full of rage, had stormed out of the house. He'd walked aimlessly through the cold, down Meadow Creek Road, and he'd ended up at the Whitmore's farmhouse. He knew them. Everyone knew them. They'd been kind to him when he was younger. Clara Whitmore had treated him once when he'd cut his hand playing outside. Ernest Whitmore had tutored him in reading when he was struggling in school. But that morning, Tommy Riker didn't see kindness. He saw a symbol of everything he didn't have: a happy home, a loving family, stability, peace. He saw people who represented a life he could never have. He knocked on the door. Ernest answered. He invited Tommy inside, asked if he was okay, offered him something to eat. Tommy snapped. He grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack beside the fireplace, and he attacked. Ernest tried to fight back, but was too old, too frail. Clara came into the room. Tommy attacked her too. He described the violence in detached, emotionless terms. He said he didn't remember much of it. It was like watching himself from outside his body. When it was over, both Ernest and Clara were dead. Tommy stood there, covered in their blood, and realized what he'd done. He ran. He went home. He cleaned himself up. He burned his clothes in the backyard. And he never told anyone. For 40 years, he lived with it. He married. He had children. He worked. He drank. He got into fights. He lived a hard, angry life. But he never told anyone what he'd done on Christmas morning, 1968. The motive, as he explained it, wasn't rational. It wasn't about robbery. It wasn't even about hatred for the Whitmore specifically. It was about rage, about his own miserable home life, about feeling powerless and invisible, about seeing 2 people who had everything he didn't: love, respect, peace, and wanting to destroy it. He said he'd thought about turning himself in over the years, but he never did. He convinced himself that if no one knew, if he just kept living, eventually it would fade. But it never did. Thomas Riker was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in June 2009. Due to his age and health, and the fact that the crimes had occurred when he was 18, the judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life, rather than life without parole. Riker is currently incarcerated at the Mount Olive Correctional Complex in West Virginia. He's eligible for parole in 2034, though it's unlikely to be granted. He's expressed remorse in multiple interviews, saying he's thought about Ernest and Clara every day since it happened. But that remorse, for the people of Greenbrier County, came 40 years too late. The resolution of the case brought relief, but it also brought profound sadness. For 40 years, the community had lived with the fear that a dangerous stranger had passed through and killed the Whitmores. The truth was worse. It wasn't a stranger. It was a local teenager. The paperboy. Someone the Whitmores had known. Someone they'd helped. Someone they'd welcomed into their home on Christmas morning, because that's who they were. Kind, trusting, generous people who believed in helping others. And that kindness had been repaid with violence. The Whitmore family, the surviving children and grandchildren who'd lived for decades without answers, finally had closure. But the weight of the betrayal was crushing. Ernest and Clara had spent their lives serving their community. They'd opened their door to a troubled young man on Christmas morning, and he'd killed them for it. The case became a symbol of something painful, that sometimes evil doesn't come from outside. It comes from within, from the troubled kid down the road, from the person you tried to help, from someone whose rage and pain are so deep that even kindness can't reach them. Was Tommy Riker's crime a betrayal of the holiday spirit, or a deep-seated cry for help masked by the season? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Riker himself has said in interviews that he wasn't trying to send a message. He wasn't making a statement about Christmas. He was just a kid who was drowning in anger, who made a choice in a moment of rage that destroyed lives, his victims, his own, and the lives of everyone who loved the Whitmores. The people of Greenbrier County still visit the Whitmores' graves. Every Christmas, wreaths are placed at their headstones. 40 years later, Ernest and Clara are still remembered, still mourned, still loved. But the grief is complicated now, because the person who killed them wasn't a faceless monster. He was someone they knew, someone they tried to help. And that's the hardest truth of all, that sometimes the worst violence comes not from strangers in the dark, but from people we've invited into the light. People we've tried to save. People who, for reasons we'll never fully understand, choose destruction over redemption. Ernest and Clara Whitmore believed in the goodness of people. They believed in helping those who were struggling. They believed in opening their door, even on Christmas morning, to someone who needed kindness. And that belief cost them their lives. What do you think? Was Tommy Riker's crime a betrayal of the holiday spirit? Or a deep-seated cry for help masked by the season? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and subscribe to Plain Sight Docs for more investigations into the cases that haunt small-town America.